Okay, here we go. Folks, people in many countries think of the world as having a giant fence around it with a big sign on it saying, "Keep out." But we at the Mannkal Foundation think of it differently. We fit that bloody great fence up with lots of gates, and on the gates are signs saying opportunity. So far, Mannkal Foundation has welcomed over 600 young West Australian future leaders to opportunities that will enrich the texture of their intellectual lives for the rest of their lives. This thrust is now generally known as intellectual entrepreneurship, and we want to do more of that, and we can learn from experts in that field, and we have one such expert with us tonight in the form of Dr. Tom Powell. He's been at it for over 30 years. Tom's the Executive Vice President of International Programs at the Atlas Network in Washington, DC, as well as being a Senior Fellow of the Cato Institute. Tom has been an active participant in almost every tipping point in the world for the last 30 years. If there's some momentous event happening, a fall of a wall in Berlin or the transition to freedom in the former Soviet Union countries, Tom was there playing an active part. And one of my early memories of seeing Tom in action was in September 1990 in Moscow, when communism was right in the midst of collapsing to the point where they were tipping statues over, where they were changing the name in the nearby Leningrad back to St. Petersburg, when there were riots in the street, when the food that they brought in to feed our contingent of 40 visiting people there running a Transition to Freedom seminar, when the food they brought in to feed us had to be brought in under armed guard because the people in the street were starving. They were asking at the food as it was being unloaded from the trucks. So when we got the food, it was so bloody bad we couldn't eat it. So Tom and I have been through a lot of these adventures, and I want him to tell us tonight about some of his adventures, and I want that to stimulate you to ask him some questions about some countries. Some of the countries that he's been at, some of the countries in which he's smuggled books on the free market into those countries, under great danger to his life, I must say, and he's alive and well to be with us tonight. Now, you brought the message to those people. There were some nights, Tom, there were 1,200 people in the audiences listening to your lectures. They were hungry for this knowledge of what to do with free enterprise because it was arriving tomorrow. And they had no instruction book. But Tom methodically took them through step by step, and I just sat there mesmerised at hearing his message. Tom, I hope that you've got such recipients as your audience in Canberra and Sydney for the rest of the week. Ladies and gentlemen, my pleasure, Tom Palmer.
Well, thank you very much. It's really an honour for me to be here in Australia. I've only been once before. That was Sydney, which is a beautiful city, but it's not all of Australia. And I was also deathly ill because I had picked up a number of unpleasant diseases on my travels. I had whooping cough, a liver infection, and parasites. I lost about 30 pounds. But I didn't miss any of my lecture engagements and was able to complete the trip. So now I get to be here on somewhat better conditions and be able to meet Australians. I was talking to some of you earlier about what I like about Australian culture. I'll share that just for a moment. This being my first time really to Australia rather than only downtown Sydney. I've met Australians all around the world, and I've never met one I didn't like. I wondered, maybe they don't let them leave the country. They have a niceness when you leave. But a few things that really struck me. Number one, I like to spend time in pubs talking to people. And invariably, if a group of people come up and say, hey, come sit with us, they're always Australians. There's a certain warmth and common friendship that characterizes the culture here. And the second thing is not being too full of yourselves. Not being snooty or having your nose in the air. One of my best friends, one of the smartest people I've ever known in my life, who I met at university, did his doctorate in mathematical physics. He's a really smart guy. He knows mathematics that I could barely begin to understand. He's also good with numbers. He did his doctorate at Oxford University in mathematical physics. And he figured they offered him a lectureship at the university, and they were going to pay £20,000, or he could work on Wall Street for £150,000. He worked out the second one was bigger than the first one, and moved to Wall Street. He's now a senior executive at Google, doing mathematical programs there. But if you ask him, what did he study? He says, I took some math courses at university. He doesn't start out by saying, I have a doctorate in mathematical physics. That's one of the things I really admire about this country. A little bit about what I do, what our organization does, and then a little bit about why. We have a network of organizations around the world. So it's about 400, of which about 220 are very, very active. And they all promote, in different countries and different contexts, the idea of a free society. And the policies, the instantiation, what it means to live as a free and independent person with dignity and worth in an economy characterized by the adding of value or wealth production rather than mere redistribution or fighting over a shrinking pie, which characterizes too much of the world. People are dedicated to adding value, to being the creators, in whatever capacity one has in an economy. So we work with groups all around the world. We have a number of partners here in Australia. Mannkal is a very important one. IPA, Centre for Independent Studies, and others that are very, very important here in Australia. Also New Zealand, Malaysia, Indonesia. I was in Hong Kong with the Lion Rock Institute. So there's a great group there. We have partners across Latin America, Eurasia, North America, Europe, and so on. And increasingly also in Africa, which is one of our new areas we're doing a lot more work in. What I do is to go to those places, talk to public audiences, do interviews. I had a presentation yesterday on why it's important for Hong Kong to remain #1 in the Economic Freedom Index, and why they should resist this backsliding, which is taking place right now, one exception after another. I pointed out the first exception to a principle makes the second one easier. The second one makes the third one a lot easier. And you find yourself on a slope that becomes increasingly slippery as you go down it. And we should not forget the examples of countries that had been prosperous and successful that slid down that slippery slope. One I have in mind is Argentina. At one time, a wealthy country. It had a per capita income that was higher than that of the United States at the time. Huge numbers of people voluntarily went to Argentina. I have a good friend who's a professor of economics at the university. All 4 of his grandparents emigrated separately from Denmark and met in Argentina. He was the outcome. He does say he wished they had met in New York. They made a mistake. But at the time, it seemed like the right choice. But Argentina took the path of populism, redistributionism, and that led to authoritarianism, the destruction of their constitution, authentic fascism, and the slide in lurching from one crisis to another, which characterizes the country today. Another one I would mention is the United States, which has slipped pretty dramatically in the economic freedom rankings. It's now 18, nothing to be really proud of. You know, Americans are proud of saying, we're #1, but saying we're number 18 just somehow doesn't have the same ring to it. And we've seen other countries, Australia, #5, New Zealand, and Canada moving up the rankings. And I tell people consistently around the world, if you want to see how a mature political culture deals with these issues, don't look to the United States right now, because the U.S. is failing consistently at one point after another, unable to get spending under control. The United States government, I would say, is spending money faster than a drunken sailor Friday night after payday. But that would be an insult to drunken sailors everywhere. So I'm not going to say that. Canada, on the other hand, having had a real crisis in the 1990s, they experienced too expansive government, extraordinarily generous is not the right word, but profligate welfare state, and they hit the wall in the 1990s and had a discussion among the parties of the left and the right about what to do about this. And they have reduced their national debt. It's actually gone down, unlike their neighbors to the south, where it's just gone simply through the roof. And they made hard decisions about trimming government expenditure and bringing their government under control, reestablishing principles of federalism on which Canada was founded. So if you want a good example, Australia, New Zealand, Canada are much better models right now for the world than the United States. So when I go to these countries, I spend time, as I mentioned, in public meetings, media, debates. I'll be debating a Marxist in Sydney, Frank Stilwell, on is capitalism a moral economic system? You can guess what I think is the answer and what he thinks would be the answer on that. But I also spend time with our partners who are setting up new organizations. And quite often, the ones who establish them are dreamers. They're academics, they're writers, they're poets. They want and yearn for freedom, for the rule of law. But I explain, a think tank is also a business. You have to budget, you have to do all those things that a normal for-profit business does as well. A good governance structure, a good board of directors who look over your shoulder and ask you to justify your behavior. You need to have an accountant, you have to make sure you have a revenue stream to finance it. Those are very important parts of a think tank. And that's one of the things I do, is I spend time going over business plans and budgets and helping them to turn these into successful organizations. And we've had a number that have been planted in Central Asia, the Central Asian Free Market Institute, set up by a group of very young people. The oldest one was 26. He was considered an old man in the organization. And they've been enormously successful in moving the region much more towards free market policies, especially Kyrgyzstan, where their office is. They're introducing visa-free travel, open skies policy, introducing free trade policies, and so on, in a very difficult part of the world, former Soviet republic, surrounded by regimes that are not very friendly to liberty. This trip I'm taking here is one of my standard trips. It was Washington to Hong Kong, Hong Kong to Perth, Perth to Sydney, Sydney to Canberra, Canberra to Brisbane, Brisbane to Dubai, Dubai to Casablanca, then Rabat, Ifran, then I go to Libya, Tripoli, and Benghazi, where we have new partners being established there. I'll have meetings with them. And then, as normal, on to Kazakhstan and Almaty for the establishment of the new libertarian free market think tank in Kazakhstan, then back to Washington, and then repeat. I've got another schedule that starts 10 days after that. Now, I've been doing this for a long time, and I started it actually in the late 1980s. A number of people, Ron was among them, had a feeling that the Soviet Union was going to collapse. And I have to say this was actually a minority opinion at the time. Most people thought it was going to lurch on forward. It would be here in 50 years. And we had a sense that's not going to happen. This system is over. It's finished. The question is, what's going to replace it? Because the mere collapse of a tyranny does not mean you get freedom. You might get a tyranny even worse. And we saw that in some of the former Soviet republics collapsed into even more horrifying tyrannies. I have in mind Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. These are scary places. We call these the scary stands. And then Tajikistan, monstrous civil war, over 100,000 people in a very small country killed. So it doesn't follow that if a bad regime collapses, it just means liberty. You need to have the institutions of the free society. And those are an achievement. They are not easy. They are not the normal default state. You have to be able to build a judiciary. You have to build expectations in the population that your government officials will not be there just to shake you down constantly. that if a policeman comes and demands a bribe from you, you should be angry and outraged at that rather than saying, well, that's just how things are, and resigning yourself to that. You have to develop a spirit of toleration, that another person who disagrees with you, you can disagree. You can say, I don't share that opinion. You can be angry. You can walk away, but you don't shoot them. And that's actually a hard thing for human beings to do. It's a learned habit. Our civilization that we take such pride in, you think about the principles of the common law and constitutionalism. These are an actual achievement. They're not the natural state of humanity. For most of the existence of the human race, the kind of liberty that we experience today, that we take for granted, is simply unthinkable. They were ruled by despots, they were ruled by warlords, they were ruled by tribal chieftains in a state of constant subjugation. Everyone here is the descendant of slaves at some point in the past. Everyone, including me. At some point, some of our ancestors were actually slaves held by others. This is true of every society where slavery was a norm. Now we think it's preposterous, it's absurd, it's an outrage. If we find isolated examples of some enslavement of another person, it offends our moral sensibility. This is a recent achievement in human history that would not have offended people just a few hundred years ago, a few thousand years ago. It was simply normal. That was the condition that people were in. Some were masters and some were slaves. So to build those institutions is a very difficult project. It requires public education, but it also requires thoughtful implementation of reforms to institute such things as independent judiciary, rather than what they call in much of the world telephone justice. Telephone justice is when the judge gets a telephone call from the Minister of Justice who says, you have a case before you, I want you to know Smith is my friend. Smith is going to win the case and Jones is going to lose. That's telephone justice. And getting beyond that and having the rule of law and an independent judiciary is a difficult thing to accomplish. So those are the kinds of things that we work on. I had that experience with a few people saying this is over, and so I left my job and I moved to Austria, which is a well-positioned country, like a little dagger inserted into the Eastern Bloc. It was a neutral country, not a member of NATO, and relatively free access to Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and so on. And I just began going to those countries. I raised a little bit of money here and there. I basically called people I knew and said, I'm trying to get rid of communism, can I have $500? And some people were crazy enough to say, okay, I'll give you $500 or $5,000. And I slept on a couch with some Austrian friends, worked with people, and bought photocopying machines, found the dissident intellectuals were the people I wanted to meet, and delivered to them photocopiers, paper. Paper was illegal, so just delivering 1,000 sheets of paper was itself an illegal act. Paper was accounted for by the state. Delivering samizdat, or self-published illegal books, Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and people of that sort in Russian and Czech. And also fax machines. One thing I learned was that the KGB was unable to tap a fax transmission. They had those little alligator clips, you remember from the old spy movies. They could tap a phone conversation. But they didn't, they were so poor, they didn't have any fax machines. And to tap a fax transmission, you have to have a fax machine. When they put on their alligator clips, all they heard was and they didn't know what it was. So it was a way for people to communicate without being observed by the authorities. You write your message, you faxed it to someone, and then you destroyed the paper you wrote it on. No record of it, no ability for them to know what it was that was being said. And we helped to establish a number of organizations to get books published in Russian, in Czech, in Bulgarian, in Hungarian, and other languages that I think contributed to the development of what we would call liberal, democratic, capitalistic culture after the collapse of these systems. I then went back to academia and went on and did my graduate studies and did my doctorate and so on. And then with the 9/11 attacks in the United States, I was very alert. Something's gone wrong in the world. The response of the United States government was, let's start invading places. I don't think has been a terribly successful response. With some other people, I said, we need to begin talking to people and promoting the ideas of free societies, societies based on toleration and mutual respect throughout the Middle East, the broader Muslim world. And at the Cato Institute was able to establish programs in Arabic, in Persian, in Urdu, in Kurdish, and other languages, and find the people who stand up for our values. And I should point out, these are very brave people. To be someone who's willing to stand up and say, as some of our friends do, like Mustafa Akyol, apostasy is a human right. Now, apostasy means leaving your religion. In Saudi Arabia, if you leave Islam, they do murder you. That's what they do. And for a Muslim to stand up and say, conscience is God's gift to the human race, your conscience cannot be dictated by the state. If you leave the correct religion, you will have to deal with God about that, but not the hangman or the civil authorities. We want freedom of religion in the Islamic world as well as elsewhere. So these are very, very brave people to stand up for these principles. And I've had several friends who have been killed in the process because they believe in justice. They believe in our values and our principles in their society. Then we expanded that, doing work in basically all around the world. And in 2009, I took all those programs from the Cato Institute and moved them to the Atlas Network, where we're able to generate more synergies, to use that buzzword from business school, with think tanks around the world, and to be able to build these networks much more dramatically. A couple of things that I've learned along the way. And the first thing is, this may be a little shocking to some people, and I know even Ron might raise his eyebrows at this, because he's been promoting the idea of Western civilization as a topic worthy of study, university, high school, for people to embrace the best values of Western civilization. And I agree with that. I don't, however, go places and say, I defend Western values, because it's not clear what Western values mean. So if we take the Chinese context, for example, China, mainland China, was dominated by communism, horrifying form of collectivism that murdered millions and millions of people. About 45 million people killed during the so-called Great Leap Forward in China. The biggest mass extermination of human beings in the history of the human race. Now, was that an Asian value? Well, Karl Marx was not Chinese. I checked. He was German. He was a product of Western civilization. This was a Western idea imposed on the Chinese by force. And our Chinese free market, classical liberal friends say, there have been many crazy things in the history of China, but never was anyone insane enough as to promote the total abolition of property rights in our history. This is a European import, brought to us by European philosophers. So we reject it. It's not a Chinese tradition. And that teaches us something. Every civilization has a narrative of liberty, and these are the Western values that one wants to embrace. Liberty, the rule of law, the significance, worth, and dignity of every human being. But there's also a tradition of power and domination in every civilization and culture. Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, these are all Westerners also, and that is a part of Western history. It is the one that is objectionable and should be rejected, as opposed to the tradition of law, justice, freedom that should be embraced. But that principle is true of every culture and civilization. There's a narrative of power and domination, but there's also a narrative of liberty. And part of my job working with people is to uncover that narrative of liberty, kind of intellectual archaeology, if you will. The oldest word in any human language for liberty, of which we have record, is emoji. It's Sumerian, and it was discovered on stelae by French archaeologists in the city of Lagash, the ancient Sumerian city of Lagash, which is Tello in contemporary Iraq. It's a Middle Eastern concept, if you want to look at it that way. There are traditions of liberty in China. There are traditions of liberty in Islam. There are traditions of liberty every place in the world. And what I try to do is to help people to uncover those and embrace those as the instantiation of universal values, or what we would call the best of the Western civilization. Those are universal principles of values that are not specific only to Westerners or people derived from European civilization or culture. The other thing is to work on the very difficult problem of transition. And this is something we learned a lot about with the collapse of totalitarian systems. In 1990 at this conference that Ron and I were both at in Moscow, very memorable, I had actually gone to Moscow in advance to be the advance man, picking hotels and so on, which was also quite an experience. The conference center that we were at was crumbling. Nothing worked. If you put your hand on a handrail, it just broke off. You could tumble down the stairs. The stairs, rather than a nice crisp point like this, they're all crumbled down. And I like to ask, this is the nicest place we could find in Moscow for this, I like to ask the Europeans and Australians and so on, I'd say, how old do you think this building is? They'd say, well, 50 years? I'd say, well, interesting answer. This is the first event ever held in it. It was completed less than 6 months ago. This is how the Soviet Union worked. They made things convenient. Everything was made pre-broken. So it was easy. You didn't have to go to the trouble of breaking it yourself. That was how it was delivered to you. At that event, Milton Friedman gave a presentation. And he had delivered it by video. And he said there are three things you have to do in the Soviet Union. Privatize, privatize, and privatize. That sounded like a great idea. Privatize everything. Years later, the Cato Institute held another conference in 2004 that I was involved in, also in Moscow. By that time, Milton Friedman had changed what he said. He was a humble person also, not an arrogant one who would defend every of his previous views. He said, I want to take that back. We did not understand the nature of the problem. Privatize into what? When there's no property system, no property law, no judiciary to resolve disputes among persons in the normal legal fashion. There was no legal system in the Soviet Union. They had commands and orders, do this, do that, do the other thing, but not law as a system for people to adjudicate their disputes, a kind of horizontal understanding of law, which is what property law and contract law are all about. It was absent. And in the absence of that, how can you have a market economy? It's a very difficult thing to grow and to create. We now know more about these problems and are in a better position to bring people from former Soviet Union and China to help people to build those institutions. But there's one thing you have to have, and this is why Mannkal and IPA and so on are very important. That's people who embrace the values, who understand them, and who say, this is the kind of person I want to be. A person who believes in a future which everyone should enjoy the benefit of the law. There should be no special privileges for anyone because they're in the right party, or they have the right relationship with the Prime Minister, or come from the right family. Everybody should be equal before the law. Everybody should enjoy equal human rights. Everybody should have the right to express their opinion, to worship God as they choose, or not. the right to be able to exchange freely on terms that they choose, not dictated to them by the people with power or by the cronies. And that means widespread education. I've met a number of the Mannkal scholars, and these young people get it. They understand it. And they are very committed to the future of Australia as a free society, as a society that instantiates those principles of justice, and people who are willing to do that and stand up for these ideas, not because there's something in it for me, but because it's the right thing to do. Because it is what you expect of a citizen of a free society, not because there's a particular special benefit for doing so. And it does mean sometimes one makes great sacrifices because you do it, because it's the right thing to do. And I hope that Australia will continue to be a free society, to instantiate those principles of decency, respect, and the rule of law, because they can be lost if you don't pay attention to the foundation of the social order. With that, I would like to hear your views on the future of Australia, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tom. I have the privilege and the honour of delivering the vote of thanks, and he's made my job very easy by delivering what has been a very entertaining and engaging speech this evening.